Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. We set the table for 10 even though only 9 of us were coming, and that choice shaped the entire day in ways I didn't understand until much later. The house already smelled heavy by mid-morning, layered with butter, roasted herbs, starch, and sweetness. The windows were fogged from the ovens running nonstop, and the floorboards felt warm through my socks. Everything had the thick, insulated feeling that always came with Thanksgiving, like the outside world had been sealed off and all that existed was food and family and routine. My mother arranged the place settings herself. She moved slowly, carefully, the way she had since my uncle died in February. He'd been her older brother, and his absence sat in the house like an extra piece of furniture. Nobody wanted to move. When she counted out the plates, she stopped at 9 and then went back to the cabinet without saying anything. She took down another plate, then another fork and knife, and laid them at the head of the table on the left side, where he always used to sit. The chair stayed tucked in, aligned perfectly, untouched. She said it felt wrong to leave the space empty. She said a lot of things felt wrong lately. The rest of us moved around that chair without acknowledging it. We stepped wide around it when carrying dishes. Coats were hung over other chairs, never that one. It became a fixed point, something the room quietly oriented itself around. By the time everyone arrived, the table looked complete, symmetrical, normal in a way that was slightly unsettling if you looked too long. Dinner started late, as it always did. The food crowded the table so tightly that the placemats disappeared beneath bowls and platters. Steam rolled upward every time a lid was lifted, and the air felt damp and heavy. I sat 2 seats down from the empty chair, close enough that I could see it clearly without turning my head. At first, nothing seemed off. Plates filled and refilled. Serving spoons moved from hand to hand. The sound of cutlery and the low, constant noise of people eating filled the room. I focused on my plate, on the familiar comfort of the meal, on the rhythm of chewing and swallowing that required no thought. It was sometime after the turkey had been passed for the second time that I noticed something dark on the floor, near the empty chair. At first I thought it was a shadow, maybe a spill from earlier that I'd missed. The lighting in the dining room was uneven, warm bulbs above the table and darker corners near the walls. Then I saw it change shape. A thick drop of gravy hit the floor with a soft, wet sound. It landed directly beneath the edge of the table near the empty place setting. Another drop followed a few seconds later, stretching before it broke free, slow and deliberate. I looked up at the table. The gravy boat sat near that place, its ladle resting inside it. The bowl was full, darker than usual from the drippings, glossy under the lights. The ladle handle extended over the rim, angled outward toward the empty plate. Gravy dripped again. No one else reacted. Plates continued to clink. Hands moved. The table vibrated slightly as someone shifted in their seat, but nothing else changed. I watched closely now. The ladle handle was moving, barely, tilting downward a fraction at a time. Each movement was followed by another slow spill. The gravy wasn't sloshing from the bowl. It was being pressed up and over the edge of the ladle, forced out in controlled, uneven pulses. My first thought was that the table wasn't level, that the weight of the ladle was finally overcoming its balance. But the motion didn't match gravity. It paused between drips. It adjusted. I leaned forward, my chair legs scraping softly against the floor. Still no one noticed. My heart started to beat faster, not with panic yet, but with a tight, alert focus. I needed to understand what I was seeing before reacting. Another drop fell. I stood and crouched down, reaching for a napkin to wipe the floor before it spread further. As I lowered myself, I had a clear view under the table. The underside was shadowed, but the light from above filtered down enough that I could see the legs of the chairs, the shoes of my family, and the empty space where my uncle's feet would have been. The gravy dripped again, landing inches from my hand. I looked up through the gap between the table edge and the chair. From this angle, I could see the ladle clearly. The handle was rotating inward now, slowly returning to a more upright position after each spill, then tipping again. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, like fingers tightening and releasing. There was no hand. I froze there, kneeling on the floor, my fingers sticky with gravy, my neck craned at an awkward angle. My breathing went shallow. I waited for the movement to stop, for gravity to finish whatever process had started. It didn't. Instead, the ladle tipped farther than before, enough that a heavier stream poured out, splashing onto the tablecloth and dripping down in a thick line. The tablecloth darkened, soaking it up. I followed the handle with my eyes, tracing it back toward the center of the table. That was when I noticed the turkey platter. It was enormous, heavier than any single dish on the table, placed slightly off center because of the extra setting. Earlier, someone had bumped the table while passing a dish, and the platter had shifted a few inches. I remembered it clearly now, the way my mother had straightened it, without moving the empty chair. The turkey platter pressed against the edge of the gravy boat, just enough to keep it from sliding outright. The ladle handle was pinned between the platter and the rim of the bowl. Every time someone cut into the turkey, the pressure shifted slightly. The turkey was still hot, its juices running, its structure softening as pieces were removed. As the meat collapsed inward, the platter settled lower by tiny increments. Each shift applied pressure to the ladle handle, squeezing it against the rim of the gravy boat. The gravy was being forced out slowly, rhythmically, in response to the changing weight and balance of the food. From above, it looked intentional. From below, it looked like a hand. I stayed crouched there longer than necessary, watching until the movement stopped entirely. Eventually, the turkey was light enough that the pressure eased. The ladle came to rest. No more gravy fell. I wiped the floor thoroughly, replaced the napkin, and stood back up. My legs felt weak, but the room hadn't changed. Everyone was still eating, unaware. The empty chair remained untouched. I didn't say anything. I couldn't, not without sounding unhinged. The explanation made sense now, solid and mechanical, but the image lingered in my mind. The timing, the placement, the way the motion had mimicked something living. Later, after the plates were cleared and the leftovers packed away, I returned to the dining room alone. The table was stripped bare except for the cloth, now stained in several places. The empty chair was still there. I moved it back slightly and adjusted the table, leveling it properly this time. I shifted the centerpieces and imagined how easily the same thing could happen again, if we weren't careful. When I finished, I carried the extra plate, fork, and knife back to the cabinet and put them away. The space at the table felt different immediately. Less crowded, more honest. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the scene over and over, not because I feared what I'd seen, but because of how close I'd come to misinterpreting it. Grief had sharpened our senses and dulled our judgment at the same time. We had built meaning into that empty space, and my mind had rushed to fill in the gaps when something strange happened there. The next year, we set the table for 9. The meal was quieter, simpler, and nothing spilled without a clear reason. The chair stayed pushed and unused, just furniture again. I still think about how easily the ordinary can become terrifying when loss is already sitting at the table. Thanksgiving traffic had turned the interstate into a slow, blinking ribbon of red lights, and the sky over the panhandle was already losing its color. Even though it was still early afternoon. We had left Dallas before dawn with leftovers containers stacked in a cooler and a pie sweating through its foil. My brother was driving, tight-lipped and irritated, the way he always got when he felt boxed in by other people's decisions. The radio kept cutting in and out, Every few minutes someone leaned on a horn. We were supposed to be in Amarillo by dinner, supposed to be sliding into a booth at our aunt's place before the turkey cooled. When the exit came up, it felt like relief. A clean, empty ramp angling away from the stalled traffic. It wasn't marked on the map app, but my brother had that stubborn faith in roads that look like they want to be used. He took it without hesitation. The interstate noise fell away. The ramp dropped us onto a narrow two-lane with faded lines and gravel shoulders. The land opened up, flat and pale, stitched with barbed wire and occasional cattle. The app spun uselessly and then went blank. No signal, no reroute, just us and the road. 10 minutes later, the temperature gauge climbed like it had somewhere urgent to be. The heater started blowing cold air, then nothing at all. A sweet, burnt smell seeped through the vents. My brother pulled over where the shoulder widened, just enough to keep us out of the lane. When he popped the hood, a cloud of steam lifted and drifted sideways in the wind. We stood there with our hands in our pockets, watching it thin out and vanish into the wide afternoon. There were no houses, no silos close enough to look real, no trees tall enough to break the horizon. The fields rolled on with that West Texas emptiness that makes distance hard to judge. The wind pressed against us and kept moving. We tried our phones anyway, standing on tiptoe, walking a few steps up the road, lifting them toward the sky. Nothing. The bars never appeared. Cars passed, but not many. Some slowed and then sped up again. Others drifted by with drivers staring straight ahead. Time stretched. The sun slid lower, turning the fields a dull gold. When the pickup finally pulled over, it felt like a change in weather. It was an older model with a dull paint job and mud in the wheel wells. The driver stepped out and walked back toward us. He looked like someone who spent a lot of time outside, face lined, hands cracked. He pointed down the road in the direction we had come from, and then farther on, explaining something about town and distance. I couldn't hear much over the wind and the traffic. He made a suggestion with his hands, and then nodded toward the passenger seat. My brother didn't hesitate. He always trusted motion more than waiting. He took his jacket from the back seat, zipped it up, and left the rest of his things behind. He clapped me on the shoulder in a way that felt light at the time, casual, and then walked toward the pickup. I watched him climb in. The truck pulled back onto the road and disappeared in a line of dust and sunlight. I stayed with the car. It felt like the sensible choice. One of us should be there if help came. I sat on the guardrail and then paced. I counted the fence posts. I checked the engine again, even though there was nothing to do. The sun kept sinking. The wind picked up and cut through my coat. I thought about our aunt's kitchen, the smell of sage and butter, the way the house always got loud before dinner. I imagined my brother calling me from town, triumphant, telling me how far away he was and how long it would take. An hour passed. Then another. The light changed from gold to gray. Shadows stretched across the road. A few more cars passed, their headlights on now, brief white sweeps across the fields. I started to feel foolish for not going with him. I imagined him sitting in a warm diner somewhere, drinking coffee, waiting for a tow truck. The image kept me calm for a while. When the pickup came back, it was near sunset. The sky had gone orange at the edges and purple overhead. I recognized the truck by its shape and the way it slowed too late and then braked hard. It pulled over in front of me, the engine ticking. The driver stepped out alone. He walked back and pointed down the road again, then farther on, gesturing with a kind of apology in his shoulders. He explained that my brother had decided to get out early and walk the rest of the way. He used his hands to show a distance that didn't feel small. He shrugged, as if to say he couldn't stop him. I stood there, the wind loud in my ears, trying to make sense of it. Walking, in that light, in that cold. I looked down the road and saw nothing but a narrowing ribbon of asphalt and the fields leaning away from it. The driver got back in and left. His taillights faded, and then there was only the road again. I waited longer than I should have. Part of me believed my brother would appear out of the dark, waving, annoyed at the fuss. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was gone. I sat in the car with my hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee from the thermos. I turned the dome light on and off. I watched my breath cloud the air. When it was fully dark, I started walking, staying close to the shoulder, my phone flashlight cutting a weak cone ahead of me. I found him less than a mile down the road. At first I thought it was a jacket caught on the fence. Then the light hit his shoes, the ones he wore on long drives, comfortable and worn. He was lying in the ditch on the far side of the shoulder, half-turned, one arm bent under him. The ground was uneven there, rutted and dry. He had slipped or stepped wrong. His head had struck something hard. There was blood on the dirt, dark and already drying in the cold. His phone was a few feet away, screen cracked, battery dead. There was no drama in it. No signs of a struggle. Just a fall in a place where falling mattered. He must have gotten dizzy from the cold, or the distance, or the exhaustion of the day. He must have tried to stand and failed. The road was quiet when I found him. No cars passed. The fields didn't move. I knelt there longer than I can explain, my hands useless. My thoughts stuck on the idea that he had been so close to help and still alone. I did what I could after that, which wasn't much. I walked until my legs shook and flagged down the first set of headlights that appeared. Everything that followed was procedural and slow. The authorities came. They took notes. They asked about the pickup, about times and distances. They measured the ditch and the road. They explained how quickly temperatures drop out there, how disorientation happens, how a simple injury becomes fatal when there's no one around. Thanksgiving came and went in a blur. The leftovers stayed in the cooler until they spoiled. The pie collapsed into itself. Our aunt's house was quiet that year, the table set for one less than planned. The exit that didn't exist stayed in my mind, a thin line on a flat map, and the way a decision made to save time can cost everything. I think about the pickup sometimes, about the driver's shrug, about how reasonable it all seemed. There was no villain, no mystery to solve. Just a long shoulder outside Amarillo, a cold evening, and a choice to walk the rest of the way. Thanksgiving at my aunt's house always followed the same script. Cold air, damp leaves ground into the driveway, the smell of butter and sage leaking out through the screen door. It was a big family house on the edge of town, not rural enough to feel isolated, but far enough out that the nights settled in heavy and quiet. That year felt no different at first. Cars lined the gravel, boots piled by the door, coats thrown over the banister. Football murmured from the living room. Someone had already burned the first batch of rolls. The only real change was the turkey fryer. My cousin had dragged it out to the concrete pad behind the garage, a shiny metal pot on spindly legs hooked up to a propane tank. He had been talking about deep frying for weeks, acting like it was some kind of performance instead of a meal. By the time I arrived, he had a red face and loose movements, the kind that come after a long afternoon of drinking disguised as cooking. Empty beer bottles were tucked behind flower pots and stacked along the fence, half hidden but obvious if you looked. I noticed it all without saying anything. That was how our family worked. We noticed problems and stepped around them, trusting momentum more than judgment. The fryer oil was heating as the sun dropped behind the trees, the sky going gray-blue, the temperature falling fast. Steam rose in thin waves. The air smelled sharp and greasy, mixed with propane and cold. I stood near the back door, 1 foot inside, 1 foot out, feeling that quiet tension you get when something feels slightly off, but familiar enough that you ignore it. My aunt hovered near the fryer, folding and unfolding a dish towel in her hands, nervous in the way she always got when things were not under her control. She was a small woman with quick movements and soft hands, the kind that always smelled faintly of soap and onions. When my cousin finally lowered the turkey, everything happened wrong all at once. The oil surged higher than it should have, climbing the sides of the pot. There was a sharp whoosh, not loud but sudden, and flames rolled up and over the rim like they had been waiting for an excuse. The fire wasn't dramatic at first. It wasn't an explosion. It was a controlled-looking column of orange that licked upward and then spread. Everyone reacted instinctively. People backed away. Someone inside screamed without meaning to. I stepped back onto the kitchen tile, heat washing over my face, my heart hammering as my brain tried to catch up. The smell changed instantly, hot oil and burning skin and propane. Something animal and wrong. My cousin stumbled backward, arms out, eyes wide, his balance gone. He didn't fall, but he didn't move toward the tank either. He just stood there frozen, like his body had shut down to avoid making it worse. My aunt did the opposite. She ran forward. I saw it happen in fragments. Her towel dropping, her feet slipping slightly on the concrete. Her mouth open, her face tight with fear, not of the fire but of him. I remember thinking she was going to knock the fryer over, that everything was about to go completely out of control. Then the fire went out. It didn't fade or shrink or sputter. It vanished. 1 second there was flame curling up into the cold air, and the next there was nothing but smoke. The fryer stood upright and steady, the oil still, the turkey submerged like it had been placed there gently. No spill, no damage. The propane tank untouched. The silence afterward was heavier than the noise had been. Smoke drifted lazily, gray and thin, and the cold rushed back in to fill the space where the heat had been. For a moment, no one moved. The world felt paused, like we were waiting for permission to breathe again. My aunt lay on the concrete. She was flat on her back, arms bent at strange angles, hands clenched tight against her chest. Her eyes were closed. Her face looked pale in the fading light, almost gray. I ran to her along with 2 other people, dropping to my knees. The concrete cold even through my jeans. Someone shouted for an ambulance from inside. Someone else ran for water, not knowing what else to do. Her hands were burned, red and blistered, the skin already swelling and shiny. Her sleeves were untouched. Her face, her hair, her clothes showed no sign of fire at all. It didn't make sense with what I had just seen. She hadn't fallen into the fryer. She hadn't touched the oil. She had been several feet away. She didn't wake up right away. When she did, it was brief and confused. Her eyes fluttering open and then closing again, her breathing shallow and fast. The smell of burned oil still clung to everything, mixing with the damp earth and smoke. The paramedics arrived quickly, lights flashing against the garage door, the quiet street suddenly crowded and bright. They worked efficiently, asking questions, checking vitals, wrapping her hands in thick white gauze. I stood back, my hands shaking, replaying the moment in my head again and again, trying to see where it had gone wrong. At the hospital, the waiting room was warm and smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. It was too bright, the kind of light that makes you aware of every crack in the floor and every sound your body makes. We sat in stiff chairs, coats still on, adrenaline wearing off and leaving exhaustion behind. My aunt was awake by then. She was groggy, her face slack with medication, but her eyes were clear enough to track the room. She kept lifting her bandaged hands slightly, like she was checking that they were still there. She kept asking why my cousin had grabbed her wrists. She didn't say it with anger at first. It came out confused, like a detail she couldn't fit into the rest of the memory. She asked it repeatedly, each time with a little more focus. Why he had grabbed her wrists. Why he hadn't let go. Why it hurt so much. My cousin sat hunched in a chair near the wall, his head in his hands. He hadn't said anything since the ambulance left. His face was drained of color, his earlier bravado completely gone. I watched him carefully, a slow realization forming in my chest. When the fire had flared, he hadn't been frozen the way I thought. He had moved. He had lunged forward as my aunt ran in, his drunk reflexes clumsy but desperate. He had reached for her to pull her back, to stop her from getting closer to the flames. But he hadn't grabbed her arms. He had grabbed her wrists. In my head, I replayed the image with this new understanding. His hands clamped around hers, skin to skin, both of them panicking. The heat had been intense right at that level, rising fast. When the fire vanished, the heat didn't disappear instantly. It lingered, enough to burn exposed skin. His hands had been protected, calloused and briefly shielded by the angle of his body. Hers had been facing the heat directly, held out and immobilized. She had struggled, instinctively pulling back, twisting, the skin of her hands taking the brunt of it. The sudden stop, the loss of balance, the shock had knocked her unconscious. The fire going out fast had been its own small miracle. The oil temperature had dropped just enough when the turkey settled. The propane regulator cutting off when the flame flared too high. A chain of boring mechanical safety features had worked exactly as designed. That was why the fryer was fine. That was why the turkey was fine. Her hands were not. When the doctor finally explained it, slowly and carefully, it matched what my brain had already pieced together. Second-degree burns. Painful but treatable. No nerve damage expected with proper care. Weeks of healing. Physical therapy to keep mobility. My aunt listened, nodding, absorbing it all. When she looked at my cousin, there was no anger there, just a tired sadness. She understood then. She remembered the grip, the pressure, the panic. She remembered being held in place without knowing why. Thanksgiving dinner never happened that night. The turkey stayed in the fryer, untouched, a ridiculous detail that no one had the energy to address. We drove home in silence later, the smell of smoke still clinging to our clothes. The image of her bandaged hands burned into my mind. In the years since, we stopped deep frying. We stopped drinking before cooking. We tell the story differently now, focusing on how close it came to being worse, on how lucky we were. But I remember the truth underneath all of that. I remember how fast good intentions can turn into harm, how alcohol dulls judgment at exactly the wrong moment, how a single reflex can change a day forever. Every Thanksgiving since, when I smell hot oil or hear propane hiss, my hands tingle in sympathy. I picture her lying on the cold concrete, the fire gone too fast, the danger not where anyone expected it to be. And I remember how real fear feels when it shows up without warning, in a place that is supposed to be safe. Thanksgiving at my parents' house always followed the same shape, the same gravity, as if the day itself pressed us into familiar positions. The smell of roasting turkey clung to the curtains from morning on. Butter and sage lived in the air. The windows fogged slightly from boiling pots, and someone always forgot to crack one open until the kitchen felt heavy and damp. I arrived before noon, tracking cold leaves in on my shoes, and found Grandma already in her usual chair near the end of the table, cardigan buttoned wrong, hands folded over a folded napkin, like she was already saving her place. She had been declining in small, ordinary ways for years. Nothing dramatic, no hospital stays, just slowness, forgetting the ends of sentences, losing words she once used easily. She would start a thought and then drift off, eyes still open, mouth still shaped like she meant to continue. We all worked around it. We filled in the gaps. We smiled and nodded and pretended not to notice when she repeated the same comment twice in 10 minutes. That afternoon passed gently. Football murmured from the living room. Someone adjusted the thermostat. The dog paced the kitchen hoping for scraps. Grandma sat quietly, occasionally lifting her head as if stirred by a sound only she heard. Her eyes were open most of the time. When they closed, it looked like rest, not sleep. That wasn't unusual. She often rested between moments of attention, conserving energy like an old phone battery. Dinner itself was long and full. Plates clinked. Serving spoons scraped ceramic. We ate too much as always. Grandma picked at her food, mostly mashed potatoes and gravy, the way she had been doing lately. She chewed slowly. Her jaw worked carefully. She swallowed with effort. Nothing about her seemed alarming. Tired, yes. Fragile, yes. But present. After dinner, the familiar settling happened. Chairs scooted back. The table was half cleared but never fully. Someone wrapped leftovers. Someone else stacked plates by the sink. The living room lights were dimmed. Grandma remained in her chair, leaning back slightly, hands folded again, eyes closed now. She always fell asleep after dinner. Always. It was a running certainty in our family, something we timed around. Let Grandma sleep. Don't wake her yet. She'll wake on her own. What was different this time was the silence. She usually snored softly but steadily, a thin wheezing sound that rose and fell. It was the sound of reassurance, proof of life. That night, there was none of it. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of the television, the soft clatter of dishes being washed. At first, I thought she was joking. She had a strange, dry sense of humor, even near the end. Sometimes she pretended to sleep just to make someone lean close, and then she would open one eye. When she didn't respond to her name, I smiled and leaned forward anyway. I touched her shoulder through the sweater, meaning to give a gentle shake, and the cold startled me so hard it felt like touching metal in winter. Not cool, cold. The kind of cold that does not belong in a living room full of warm food and bodies. I pulled my hand back and then reached out again, slower, pressing my palm flat this time, hoping I had imagined it. Her shoulder was firm and unyielding beneath the knit, not relaxed the way sleep makes you. Her head lolled slightly with the movement, too freely, like it wasn't being held upright by anything anymore. Her mouth was slightly open. Her lips had a gray tint that makeup couldn't hide, because she hadn't worn any that day. The next stretch of time exists in my memory as a series of physical sensations rather than events. My heart pounding in my ears, the room narrowing, someone knocking over a chair, the phone being picked up, the dog barking and then being shut into another room. I remember kneeling beside her and pressing my fingers to her neck, feeling nothing but skin and fabric, and my own pulse screaming back at me. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with practiced calm that felt cruel in contrast to our panic. They touched her, lifted her eyelids, pressed on her chest. Their faces stayed neutral. Their movements slowed. One of them checked the time. Another checked again, as if hoping to contradict the first. Their conclusion settled over the room like dust. They said she had been gone for hours. The words didn't make sense at first. Hours meant before dinner. Hours meant before we ate. Hours meant while she was still sitting there with us, nodding, chewing, resting. My mind tried to correct the statement, to round it down. Minutes would have been terrible but possible. An hour might have been a mistake. Hours was impossible. I kept thinking of her at the table, of the way she had lifted her fork, of the way she had swallowed, of the way her eyes had opened and closed. We had been with her all afternoon. There had been movement. There had been sound. There had been presence. One of the paramedics asked me to describe her voice. I stood there, suddenly empty. I tried to summon the sound of it, the texture, the pitch. I knew I had heard her. I knew she had spoken. But when I reached for the memory, there was nothing solid to grab. No words, no tone. Just the idea of sound, the expectation of it. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking up fully. The harder I tried, the less there was. The explanation came later, after the house emptied, after the body was taken away, after the leftovers sat untouched in the refrigerator. A doctor spoke to us calmly, laying out facts in a way that felt like an inventory of our denial. Grandma had suffered a massive cardiac event earlier in the day, likely early afternoon. It would have been sudden, probably painless. She would not have cried out. She would not have collapsed dramatically. Her body had simply stopped supporting itself from the inside. What we thought were signs of rest had been stillness. What we thought were small movements had been our own adjustments, our own expectations filling in gaps. Her mouth had moved because we had placed food there. The act of swallowing had been reflexive at first, then illusory. We had interpreted pauses as responses. We had nodded along to silence. Her hearing aids had been on. their faint feedback sometimes mistaken for breath or murmured sound. When someone asked her a question, someone else often answered without realizing it. We had been doing that for months. The reason I could not describe her voice was because I had not truly heard it that day. I had assumed it. I had remembered older versions of her and laid them over the present moment. My brain had smoothed over the absence the way it smooths over missing steps in a staircase you've climbed 1,000 times. She had not been alive while we ate. She had not fallen asleep afterward. She had been dead while we passed dishes and watched football and complained about traffic. She had been dead while we thanked her for recipes she could no longer explain. We had treated her body as if it were still participating, because the shape of the day demanded it. The horror of it did not come from fear of death itself, but from the realization of how easily we had missed it. How familiarity had dulled our attention. How love had become routine. The house had been warm. The food had been good. The day had been ordinary. And in the middle of it, someone we loved had slipped away without a sound, and we had kept going. In the days that followed, I replayed the afternoon again and again, searching for signs I should have recognized. The unnatural stillness, the lack of snoring, the way her hands never moved after dinner. Each memory rearranged itself under scrutiny, revealing how much of what I thought I saw had been assumption. Thanksgiving did not feel cursed or haunted after that. It felt worse. It felt fragile. It felt like a reminder that death does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently for you to notice, long after you should have. Thanksgiving at our house always ran on routine and crowding. The house was old, narrow, and designed for a family half the size of the one that showed up every November. By mid-morning, the upstairs bathroom was already claimed on a rotating basis, and everyone knew better than to linger there. The only other bathroom was in the basement, a small half-bath tucked into a concrete corner near the furnace and the sump pit. It was technically functional, but no one liked it. The light flickered, the air smelled faintly metallic, and the door swelled in damp weather. Most years we pretended it did not exist. That morning the house filled with heat, food, and bodies. The oven ran nonstop, the radiators clicked, and condensation fogged the windows. Coats piled on the banister. The smell of turkey fat and boiled vegetables settled into the walls. By early afternoon the upstairs bathroom line stalled, and my uncle, who hated waiting and always moved with a sense of urgency, headed downstairs instead. I noticed because he brushed past me carrying his phone in his hand, already scrolling, already impatient. The basement felt colder than the rest of the house, even with the furnace running. The stairs were narrow and steep, with paint worn smooth in the center from decades of shoes. The light at the bottom cast a yellow cone that stopped short of the far wall. The bathroom door sat just beyond the washing machine, its cheap hollow core painted and off, white that never quite looked clean. It stuck when you pulled it open, and sometimes scraped the floor when humidity was high. I did not think about him again for a while. Time slipped the way it always does during holidays, measured by timers and serving spoons. Plates were set out. Drinks were refilled. The television murmured in the background. People laughed too loudly, the sound bouncing off low ceilings and crowded furniture. Somewhere below us the furnace kicked on and off, a dull thump followed by a steady roar. It was maybe 10 minutes later when the pounding started. It came up through the floor, not sharp at first, more like someone dropping something heavy. Then it repeated, harder, more deliberate. The ceiling fixture over the dining table rattled slightly. A few people paused, forks suspended, heads tilted. The pounding turned frantic, a rapid series of blows that shook dust loose from the vents. My first thought was that something had fallen in the basement. The second was that someone was stuck. The sound was coming from directly below the dining room, right where the basement bathroom sat. Chairs scraped back. The pounding continued, now accompanied by muffled vibration that traveled through the framing. There was a sense of pressure in the room, the kind that comes when everyone realizes something is wrong, but no one wants to say it yet. I reached the basement stairs first. As I went down, the air grew cooler and heavier, thick with the smell of damp concrete and fuel oil. The pounding grew louder with each step, reverberating off the cinder block walls. At the bottom, the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing and distorting in the enclosed space. The bathroom door was closed. The handle was still, angled slightly downward, the way it sometimes settled on its own. I grabbed it without thinking and pulled. The door opened easily, smoothly, with none of the resistance it usually had. It swung inward and tapped lightly against the wall. The bathroom was empty. The light was on. The toilet lid was down. The sink was dry. No one stood inside. No one crouched behind the door. The pounding stopped the moment the door opened, leaving behind a sudden, uncomfortable silence that rang in my ears. I remember feeling disoriented, like I had missed a step in the dark. Other people crowded onto the stairs behind me. The space filled with bodies and confused movement. Everyone looked into the bathroom, then at each other, then back at the empty room. The smell in the air was stronger now, a sharp, rotten egg tang that made my eyes sting. It had been there before in faint traces, but never like this. We searched the basement quickly. The laundry room, the storage area, the small unfinished corner where old furniture sat under sheets. There was nowhere someone could hide without being seen. The only door out was the one at the top of the stairs, and no one had come up. The pounding had been too loud, too immediate, to be imagined. Someone noticed the phone on the sink. It lay face up, the screen dark, positioned near the edge as if set down in a hurry. The case was the one my uncle always used, scuffed at the corners, unmistakable. When it was picked up, the screen lit and showed that it was still recording. A voicemail timer ran far longer than it should have, the numbers frozen at a point several minutes in. Later, when the phone was played back, there was no mistaking the sound of his voice. It was hoarse and panicked, breath coming in short gasps. The words spilled out unevenly, repeating the same idea over and over, focused on the belief that someone was holding the door shut. He begged for it to stop. He described pressure against the door, resistance that would not give. He sounded close, as if his mouth were right next to the microphone, as if he were pressed into a corner. There was no mention of where he was beyond that. No footsteps. No background noise except a low hum and an occasional metallic clank that matched the furnace cycling on. The recording ended abruptly, not with a hang-up but with a sudden cut, as if the phone had been dropped or power lost. The house felt different after that. The warmth from the oven seemed oppressive instead of comforting. The food sat untouched on the table. No one wanted to eat. The basement door was closed and then opened again, as if checking it repeatedly might change something. The smell from below grew stronger until it crept up the stairs, unmistakable now, forcing windows to be opened despite the cold. Emergency services arrived and did what they could within the limits of the situation. The house was evacuated. Air readings were taken. The basement bathroom was identified as the source of a dangerous buildup of sewer gas caused by a cracked vent pipe and a failed trap that had dried out. The furnace intake sat too close, pulling the gas into circulation when it cycled. In that small, enclosed bathroom, the concentration would have risen quickly. The explanation was methodical and complete. Hydrogen sulfide, even at relatively low levels, can cause dizziness, confusion, and panic. At higher concentrations, it can dull the sense of smell, making the danger less obvious, and interfere with muscle control. It can create the sensation of pressure, of resistance where none exists. In extreme cases, it can cause loss of consciousness within minutes. The swollen door was addressed as well. The humidity from the gas and the damp basement air had caused the bottom edge to press against the concrete floor. From the outside, with a clear head and full strength, it opened easily. From inside, disoriented and weakening, it might have felt immovable. The pounding we heard was likely him falling or striking the ceiling as he tried to orient himself, the sound amplified by the hollow space and old framing. Search teams went through the house and the surrounding area anyway, because they had to. There was no trace of him beyond the phone and the recording. No sign he had left the basement under his own power. The working theory settled into something no one liked to say out loud, but everyone understood. He had collapsed inside the bathroom. At some point, in confusion or panic, he may have moved in a way that put him out of immediate sight, behind the furnace or into the crawl space access that sat partially concealed behind shelving. The gas would have rendered him unconscious quickly. By the time the door was opened, there was nothing to see because the space had already been altered by the rush of fresh air, dispersing what remained. In the weeks that followed, the basement was torn apart piece by piece. Walls were opened. The crawl space was searched thoroughly. The venting was replaced. Nothing was found. The absence became its own presence, heavy and persistent. Thanksgiving has not been the same since. The house no longer hosts large gatherings. The basement bathroom has been sealed off completely, the door screwed shut, the light disconnected. When I think back to that day, what stays with me is not the panic or the confusion, but the certainty in his voice on that recording. He truly believed someone was there with him, pressing back against the door, choosing not to let him out. The explanation tells me why his brain created that belief, how the gas and the space and the failing materials combined to trap him. Knowing that makes it worse, not better. It means there was no malice, no intent, nothing to fight against. Just a small room, a bad system, and time running out in silence, beneath a house full of people who thought everything was fine. Thanksgiving that year was supposed to be ordinary. It was cold but not yet winter, the kind of late afternoon where the sky goes flat and gray early, and the smell of damp leaves clings to everything. I had spent most of the day doing small, forgettable things. Carrying folding chairs from the garage, hauling a bag of ice from the gas station down the road, letting the dog out and back in while the oven ran, and the house slowly filled with the thick, comforting smell of turkey and sage. The dog had been restless all afternoon. He was an old mutt with a bad hip and a gentle temperament, not the kind to spook easily. He usually planted himself near the kitchen doorway during holidays, hoping for scraps, drifting in and out as people came and went. That day he paced. He kept circling the living room and stopping short, ears angled forward, nose working the air. I assumed he was overwhelmed by the noise and smells. The house was full by late afternoon. Coats stacked on the spare bed, shoes kicked off near the door, the television murmuring football no one was really watching. As dusk settled in, I let him out one last time before dinner. The porch light clicked on, casting a weak yellow cone onto the yard. The woods behind the house were already dark, the trees blending into a single mass. He stepped onto the porch, sniffed, and froze. His body went rigid, the fur along his spine lifted. He stared past me, not into the yard, but back toward the house. I coaxed him the way I always did, shifting my weight, patting my thigh, assuming he just needed encouragement. He did not move. His eyes stayed locked on the dining room window, where the light inside made a bright rectangle against the dark. I turned and followed his gaze. Through the glass I could see my family at the table. Everyone was seated. Plates were being filled. Hands moved, heads tipped back in laughter. It was a familiar scene, warm and ordinary. The dog refused to cross the threshold. His paws stayed planted on the porch boards, claws scraping softly as he leaned away from the door. The longer I stood there, the more unsettled I felt. There was nothing wrong inside. Nothing out of place. And yet his fear was absolute. I stepped fully outside to grab his collar. The cold hit my face. The smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the road crept into my nose. The moment my hand touched him, he bolted. He wrenched free and ran. Not toward the yard like he usually did, but straight into the trees. I watched his shape disappear between trunks, heard the crashing of underbrush fade into silence. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. He did not come back. The porch light hummed. From inside the house, through the closed door, I could hear the dull, happy noise of the gathering. Silverware clinked. Someone knocked over a glass and righted it again. Everything sounded normal. I went to the dining room window and looked in more carefully. The angle was wrong, the glass reflecting my own face faintly over the scene inside. I wiped at it with my sleeve and pressed closer. Everyone was there. Everyone who should have been there. No empty chairs. No sign of concern. No one looking toward the door. Something tightened in my chest. I tried to remember when I had last been inside. I remembered setting the table earlier. Straightening place cards. I remembered carrying food from the kitchen. But those memories felt thin, like photographs rather than lived moments. I opened the door and stepped in. The warmth wrapped around me immediately, heavy with food and bodies. The noise dropped. Heads turned. Faces shifted into surprise, then into the familiar shapes of recognition. There was a moment of confusion, the kind that happens when someone arrives later than expected. The expressions around the table made it clear they believed I had been somewhere else for a while. I stood just inside the doorway, still cold, still holding my jacket. My heart hammered. I waited for someone to notice that I had just been outside, that the dog was missing, that something was wrong. Instead, the mood settled back into place with an odd speed. Plates were passed again. Attention drifted back to the food. I took my seat slowly. My hands shook as I picked up my fork. I scanned the room for anything out of order. Everything was where it always was. The sideboard against the wall. The old clock ticking. The framed photos slightly crooked. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, and I realized my head was starting to ache. As we ate, a pressure built behind my eyes. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as hunger or stress. The food tasted dulled, as if I were chewing through cotton. I noticed people leaning back in their chairs more than usual, eyelids heavy. A couple of relatives rubbed their temples. Someone laughed too loudly, then went quiet. I thought about the dog again. He had never run into the woods like that. Not at night. Not ever. He had been staring into the house, not out. The image of him on the porch replayed in my mind, the rigid fear in his body. Animals notice things before people do. Smell sounds. Things we ignore. The headache sharpened. My thoughts felt slippery. I tried to focus on the table, on counting breaths, on grounding myself. I realized then that I could not clearly remember the last hour. There was a blank stretch of time between letting the dog out and standing at the window. The gap made my stomach drop. I stood up abruptly, chair legs scraping. The room swayed. The air felt wrong. Too warm, too stale. I moved toward the back hallway where the furnace room was, my pulse pounding in my ears. Halfway there, dizziness washed over me so hard I had to brace against the wall. The smell hit me then, faint but unmistakable. Exhaust. Not strong, not obvious, but present, threaded through the holiday scents. A memory surfaced of the old furnace acting up the week before. The pilot light flickering. A repair scheduled but postponed because of the holiday. Carbon monoxide is colorless. Odorless, people say. But old systems leak other things too. Enough to make a dog panic. Enough to make people confused, compliant, slow. I made it to the furnace room and found the door ajar. The unit was running louder than usual, rattling. A vent pipe had slipped partially loose, angled wrong, pushing exhaust back into the house instead of out. The space felt thick, oppressive. My vision narrowed. The rest happened in fragments. Fresh air from an open door. Cold rushing in. The sound of movement behind me as others followed. Drawn by the shift in atmosphere more than by understanding. The night outside biting and sharp as we spilled onto the porch and yard. Someone retching. Someone sitting down hard on the steps. Emergency lights later, red and blue slicing through the trees. Paramedics moving with calm urgency. Numbers spoken. Oxygen masks. the word exposure used repeatedly. The explanation laid out clearly once our heads cleared. Mild to moderate carbon monoxide poisoning. Enough to cause headaches, confusion, memory gaps. Enough to make time slip. The dog was found hours later, muddy and shivering, hiding at the edge of the woods. He came to me willingly then, pressing into my legs, finally calm once the house was aired out and declared safe. In the days that followed, pieces settled into place. I had gone back inside earlier than I remembered. I had sat at the table for a while, eaten, grown foggy. At some point I had stood up again, disoriented, and wandered back toward the door without telling anyone. Driven by a vague sense that something was wrong. I had let the dog out again without fully realizing it, then followed him when he refused to come back in. By the time I stood at the window, my family had already adjusted to my absence, assuming I was busy or outside for a moment. When I re-entered, my late arrival was real to them, even if it felt impossible to me. The image that stayed with me was not the confusion or the fear, but the dog on the porch, his instincts cutting through the invisible danger we could not sense. He had been trying to warn us, refusing to step back into a space that was quietly filling with poison. Every Thanksgiving since, I noticed the air more. I watch the dog. I pay attention to small, bodily signals that are easy to dismiss. And every time dusk falls early and the house fills with warmth, I remember how close normal can sit to disaster, separated only by something you cannot see, something that makes you trust the wrong version of events, while everything slowly, almost politely, goes wrong. I left right after dinner, because the weather app showed a band of heavy fog and rain rolling in from the west, and I wanted to get ahead of it. Thanksgiving had been loud and crowded and warm, and I remember feeling relieved when I stepped outside and felt the cold air on my face. The yard was dark except for the porch light, and my breath came out white. I got into my car, backed down the driveway, and pulled onto the county road with the radio low and the heater on my feet. It felt ordinary and safe, the kind of drive I had done 100 times before, the kind where your mind drifts, and you barely remember the miles afterward. About 10 minutes in, the fog started to thicken. At first it was just wisps sliding across the fields, pale and low, the way it always is this time of year. Then it turned dense and heavy, like driving into a wall. The world shrank to the narrow cone of my headlights. The road markings dulled and then disappeared. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter, leaning forward without realizing it. The radio lost its signal and faded into static, so I shut it off. All I could hear was the low hum of the engine and the steady sweep of the wipers. Even though there was barely any rain yet, the fog wasn't uniform. It moved in waves, opening briefly and then closing again, and every time it closed I felt a small, sharp spike of fear in my chest. I kept my speed low, checking the speedometer over and over, worried I would drift too far left or right without noticing. I watched for reflectors along the shoulder, counting them as they slid past, using them to keep my bearings. It felt like the road was floating, disconnected from the land around it. That was when I noticed the headlights behind me. At first they were faint, just a glow that flared and faded as the fog shifted. I assumed it was someone else leaving dinner late, or maybe a neighbor heading back toward town. I felt a small sense of relief knowing I wasn't alone on the road. But then the lights grew brighter, closer, until they filled my rearview mirror. They were uncomfortably close enough that I could see the pattern of the beams through the fog, distorted and stretched. I tapped my brakes lightly, not enough to slow much, just enough to signal that they were too close. The lights didn't back off. I told myself it was nothing. In fog like this, distances are hard to judge. Maybe they thought they were farther back than they were. I focused on the road ahead and kept my speed steady. Minutes passed. The lights stayed exactly where they were, hovering just behind me, never gaining, never dropping back. They didn't try to pass, even when the road straightened briefly. Every curve, every gentle rise and dip, they stayed glued to me. My shoulders started to ache from tension. I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. The fog pressed in from all sides, erasing the trees and fields I knew were there. The sense of being followed grew heavier with each mile. I checked my mirrors constantly, my eyes flicking back and forth. The lights never wavered. They were always there, steady and patient. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone as cautious as I was, afraid to pass in low visibility. Maybe they were using my car as a guide, letting me break through the fog for them. That made sense, and for a few moments it calmed me. But then I noticed something that didn't fit. The lights didn't behave like headlights normally do in fog. They didn't flare brighter when we slowed or dim, when we picked up speed. They didn't bounce or jitter with the imperfections in the road. They stayed fixed, as if locked in place behind me. Time started to feel strange. I couldn't tell how long I had been driving like that. The fog erased any sense of progress. Each mile felt like 10. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard and frowned, then looked again, convinced I had misread it. It seemed like too much time had passed, but the road should have ended by now. I knew these roads. I had grown up on them. I should have reached the highway already, or at least the old barn with the collapsed roof, or the intersection with the blinking yellow light. None of those landmarks appeared. Just more fog, more empty road, more reflectors ticking by like a metronome. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, startling me so badly my hands jerked on the wheel. I let it buzz without looking, my heart pounding. I didn't want to take my eyes off the road, not with the fog and the lights behind me. The buzzing stopped. A few seconds later it buzzed again, longer this time. I eased the car onto the narrow shoulder, slowed to a stop, and put it in park. My hazard lights clicked on, their sound loud in the enclosed space of the car. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the headlights were gone. The road behind me was empty. The fog rolled thick and unbroken, swallowing the space where the lights had been only seconds before. I turned my head and looked over my shoulder, checking the side mirrors, straining to see any sign of another car. There was nothing. No engine noise, no glow, no movement. Just the soft hiss of the fog and the ticking of my cooling engine. My phone buzzed again. I picked it up with shaking hands and saw a message from my sister. She said they were calling the police because they thought something was wrong. According to her, I had left 3 hours earlier. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to catch up. 3 hours made no sense. I had checked the time before I left. I remembered saying goodbye, grabbing my coat, stepping into the cold. That had not been 3 hours ago. It couldn't have been. I scrolled up, checking the timestamp, checking the battery level, checking the signal bars. Everything looked normal. The phone said it had a weak signal, but it was there. I felt a wave of cold move through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I thought about the endless stretch of road, the missing landmarks, the lights that followed me without changing. I thought about the clock on my dashboard and the uneasy feeling I'd had when I saw it. I realized I had not felt tired, not the way you do after hours of driving, but my eyes burned and my head ached as if I had been concentrating intensely for a long time. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing slowly, trying to steady myself. I turned the car off and then back on again, watching the dashboard light cycle. The clock reset and showed the correct time, matching my phone. It was much later than it should have been. The heater blew lukewarm air now, no longer fully hot. My gas gauge was lower than I expected. These were small things, but together they painted a picture I didn't like. I decided to call for help, but the signal dropped as soon as I tried. The call wouldn't go through. I sent a short message instead, telling my sister where I was as best I could, and that I was okay, or at least I thought I was. I didn't mention the headlights or the missing time. I didn't trust myself to explain it clearly. When I pulled back onto the road, I drove even slower. The fog seemed to thin slightly, just enough that I could see the faint outline of trees again. Within a few minutes, I reached the intersection with the blinking yellow light. Relief washed over me so strongly my eyes stung. I turned onto the highway and the fog began to lift for real, breaking apart into ragged patches that drifted away behind me. The rest of the drive was uneventful. I made it home without seeing the headlights again. Later, after the police confirmed I was safe and my sister stopped panicking, I tried to piece together what had happened. The most likely explanation was that I had driven into a particularly dense patch of fog, one that disoriented me enough to slow my progress to a crawl without realizing it. Stress can do strange things to perception. The headlights could have been another car that turned off onto a side road when I pulled over, their lights swallowed instantly by the fog. The missing time could have been the result of my own distorted sense of it, combined with driving far more slowly than usual, and maybe even looping back on myself without noticing. I checked the route the next day in daylight. There was a long stretch where the road curved gently and offered few landmarks, and several small turnoffs that could easily be missed in low visibility. There was also a shallow ditch near where I had pulled over, which could have reflected my own headlights back at me in the fog, creating the illusion of a car behind me that stayed perfectly aligned no matter what I did. All of that made sense on paper. It was logical and grounded and comforting in a way. But even now, when I think about that drive, about the way the fog closed in, and the light stayed with me mile after mile, I feel that same tightness in my chest. I think about how easily I lost track of time, how quickly the familiar became alien, and how thin the line is between a normal drive home and something that leaves you questioning your own memory. Since that night, I never leave early to beat the weather. I wait, even if it means driving in daylight the next day. And when fog settles over the road, I pull over and stop, no matter how empty it seems, because I know how much can disappear in it without making a sound. 3 days after Thanksgiving, the house still smelled like food. Not the good kind anymore. It was a heavy, stale mix of roasted meat, onions, and something sweet that had soared. I live alone in a small rental with a narrow kitchen, the kind where the refrigerator hum fills the room when everything else is quiet. I had cooked too much, like I always do, driven by some stubborn idea that the holiday should look full even if the house isn't. I ate leftovers straight from plastic containers for days. Turkey for breakfast, turkey sandwiches for lunch, turkey drowned in gravy for dinner. By Sunday afternoon, I was sick of it and more than a little uneasy about how long everything had been sitting. When I opened the fridge that afternoon, the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just old food, it was rot. Thick and wet and unmistakable. The turkey container was still sealed, snapped tight the way I always do it, pushed all the way to the back shelf. When I pulled it out, the lid bowed slightly, as if pressure had built up inside. The meat had turned gray. Not dry gray, but slick and damp, with a sheen that caught the light. The bottom of the container was pooled with liquid that hadn't been there before. It looked like the turkey had been left on the counter for weeks, not refrigerated since Thursday. I stood there longer than I should have, breathing through my mouth, trying to understand how that could have happened so fast. The fridge was cold. Everything else inside it looked normal. I hadn't lost power. I hadn't noticed anything off the day before. The container didn't look tampered with. Still, my stomach tightened the longer I stared at it, the way it does when something feels wrong, but there's no clear reason. I didn't hesitate after that. I carried the container straight to the trash, tied the bag tight, and took it outside to the bin. The smell lingered in the kitchen, clinging to the air and my hands. I scrubbed the trash can with disinfectant, wiped down the counters, cleaned the fridge shelves, and washed my hands until my skin felt dry and raw. By the time I finished, the kitchen looked sterile, almost bare. The fridge was mostly empty. I told myself that was fine. The holiday was over. I didn't need reminders of it hanging around. That night, I woke up with my heart racing and my mouth flooded with saliva. I barely made it to the bathroom. What came after was violent and exhausting. The kind of sickness that drains you until you feel hollow. I spent the rest of the night on the bathroom floor, shaking, sweating through my clothes, my head pounding. By morning, I was weak enough that standing felt like a mistake. I drove myself to urgent care in a fog, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. The doctor told me it was food poisoning. The explanation was simple, almost routine. Something I ate had turned. It happens more often than people think, especially around holidays when food sits longer than it should. I was sent home with instructions to hydrate, rest, and be careful. No one seemed concerned beyond that, and I wasn't either. It made sense. I had been eating leftovers for days. The turkey had looked wrong. My body had reacted the way bodies do. When I got home, it was late afternoon. The house felt off the moment I stepped inside. Not dramatic, just subtly wrong. The air was warmer than I remembered, heavy and still. I dropped my keys on the counter and went straight to the kitchen to get water. That's when I saw the trash bag. It was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, upright, tied at the top. The same black bag I had taken outside the day before. I recognized the knot I use, a double loop pulled tight. For a moment, I assumed I had forgotten to take it out, that the sickness had scrambled my memory. But the kitchen bin was empty and clean, lined with a fresh bag. I stood there, staring at the bag on the floor, trying to place the memory of bringing it back inside. There was none. My chest tightened as I leaned closer. The smell was faint now, almost gone. I untied the bag with shaking fingers. Inside was the turkey container, clean. The lid was snapped on, the plastic clear and dry. There was no meat inside, no residue. It looked like it had just come out of the dishwasher. When I touched it, I pulled my hand back instinctively. It was warm, not room temperature. Warm, like it had been recently washed or held against something. I stood there for a long time, my mind cycling through possibilities that didn't settle. I checked the back door. Lock. The windows. Closed. Nothing else in the house was disturbed. The dishwasher was empty and cold. I don't have pets. No one else has a key. I live in a quiet area. And nothing like this had ever happened before. I spent that evening cleaning again, though there was nothing left to clean. I threw the container away for good, breaking it in half before putting it in the bin outside. I stayed up late, sitting on the couch with the lights on, listening to the refrigerator hum and the occasional creak of the house. When I finally slept, it was shallow and restless. The explanation came together slowly over the next few days, not as a single revelation but as pieces that started to fit whether I wanted them to or not. The doctor had mentioned that severe food poisoning can cause disorientation, memory gaps, even sleepwalking in rare cases, especially when combined with dehydration and fever. I started paying attention to small things around the house. A cabinet door left open in the morning. My phone on the kitchen counter, when I was sure I had left it by the bed. Damp towels I didn't remember using. I checked my phone's health data and saw that my heart rate had spiked in the early hours of the night. I got sick, followed by long periods of movement recorded when I should have been asleep. I don't usually sleepwalk, but I had as a child, something my parents mentioned once and I had dismissed as irrelevant. Stress, illness, and exhaustion can bring old patterns back. The garbage pickup schedule filled in the last gap. The bin outside had been emptied that morning while I was at urgent care. The trash bag with the turkey container would have been near the top. It wouldn't have gone far in the truck before being compacted, but it could have been missed if it was wedged or stuck. I must have taken it out of the bin, later without realizing it. Confused and feverish, bringing it back inside during a period I have no memory of. I must have washed the container in the sink or dishwasher, not remembering why, responding only to the need to clean something that felt wrong. The warmth came from hot water, retained by thick plastic. By the time I found it, my mind had already erased the act. Understanding that didn't bring comfort right away. It took time to accept that my own body and brain were capable of that kind of quiet, purposeful activity without my awareness. That I could make decisions, carry objects, clean them, and then forget entirely. The horror wasn't in the turkey or the container or even the sickness. It was in the realization that the boundary between conscious intention and automatic action is thinner than I ever thought. I recovered fully within a week. The house returned to normal. The fridge was stocked with fresh food, carefully dated and spaced out. I stopped eating leftovers after 2 days. Every night before bed, I check the kitchen, make sure everything is where it should be, and take note of it. In the morning I check again. So far, nothing has moved. Thanksgiving is next week. I already know I will cook less. I will throw food away sooner than feels polite. And when I open the fridge now, I don't linger. I take what I need and close the door. Because I know how quickly something ordinary can turn, and how easily the mind can cover its tracks when it does.